everyone to this meeting hosted by Socialist Alternative. My name is Liz Walsh. I'll be chairing tonight. First up, I'd like to acknowledge that the meeting is taking place on stolen land. This is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and declare our solidarity with the ongoing struggle for land rights, for self-determination against the racist Australian state. So we've been brought together today to discuss the threat and the attack on press freedom, on journalists, on whistleblowers, and more broadly, the sort of growing authoritarianism in Australian society. Australia's really leading the way in terms of the development of the surveillance state. So we thought it was important to have a few introductions and to have a discussion with people from the left who are committed to the struggle to defend democratic rights and for the fight for a better society. So our first speaker tonight is going to be Jeff Sparrow. Jeff Sparrow is a long-time figure of the left, and he's a journalist, ex-broadcaster, I'm told now. He's just recently quit radio, and former editor. He's someone who's regularly published in The Guardian. He wrote some important responses to the police raids as well. He's a publisher of he published a really excellent book called Trigger Warnings, looking at the rise, I think, of political correctness and an approach from the left on that. And I really recommend people get that book. So welcome, Jeff.
Thanks for that introduction. Do we have to speak into this or?
No.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks you all for coming out tonight for this important subject of press freedom. Like many people, after the raids on the Daily Telegraph and the ABC, I was struck most of all by the timing of these AFP raids on these two institutions, because both of them pertain to stories that have been published a long time ago. One of the stories was a year old and the other one was 2 years old, and yet the raids happened immediately after a federal election in which, much to everyone's surprise, the Conservative government had been returned. And of course, the Australian Federal Police is the most political police force in Australia. That's kind of the point of the Billy Hughes set them up specifically to be more in tune with Canberra's sensibilities. So clearly they were conscious of the political ramifications of launching these raids immediately after an election in which the Conservatives had been returned and which the sinister figure of Peter Dutton was going to be playing a large role in Australian politics. And in that context, these raids say to journalists, you better watch what you say, you better watch what you do. At the same time, I think it would be a mistake to say that these raids came out of nowhere. As I tried to argue in the piece I wrote for The Guardian, in fact, these raids come as the culmination of a long series of attacks on civil liberties and democratic rights in Australia. And I want to talk about three different iterations of those attacks, two of them directly pertaining to these raids and one of them a little bit more general. The first one is the most obvious because, of course, the raid on the Daily Telegraph was to do with a story that one of their political journalists had run about a proposal to allow one of the security agencies to snoop on Australian citizens without warrants. And of course, this was one of these proposals that we're all very familiar with. They come up almost every year, every 2 years. Some new argument that new laws have to be introduced about terrorism or new powers have to be granted to one or another of the security agencies. And it was when I was working on that article that I was struck by something which is kind of obvious, and maybe people here kind of know it, but it hadn't registered me for a while, that of course prior to 2001 and prior to the 9/11 attacks, there were no anti-terror laws of any kind in the federal sphere in Australia, which sounds kind of bizarre because we're so accustomed to them now. I think there's something like 75 of them that have been passed since 2001. But it actually makes sense when you think about jurisprudence because, of course, all of the things that we associate with terrorism, you know, the kinds of crimes like murder or kidnapping or bombing, all of these things are crimes under the traditional common law. You don't need a special law to prosecute someone if they kill people in the course of a terrorist attack. The only reason to introduce specific terrorist legislation is if you want to cut back on the traditional rights and democratic protections that are contained in the common law that have been won by people over centuries of struggle. And you can see how as soon as you start to cut back on civil liberties, this has a corrosive effect. So the particular proposal that the article in the Telegraph was talking about was one to spy on Australian citizens without them knowing about it. If you're a government that thinks it's legitimate to spy on citizens without them knowing about it, you're also going to be a government that thinks it's legitimate to stop reporters reporting on this particular proposal. And you can see the same logic with the raids on the ABC that were to do with a story published about alleged war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. Now, Australia's been at war in Afghanistan since 2001. And that means that at the next election, there'll be a substantial cohort of people voting who have been, the entire time they're alive, Australia has been at war in Afghanistan. This is quite extraordinary, and you cannot maintain a military occupation without engaging in acts of violence and brutality, because it's the nature of a military occupation to require acts of force in order to keep the population under control. And of course, if you're a democratic country, you can't carry out acts of violence like that without having mechanisms to prevent people from knowing about them. So one of the things that happened in the war in Afghanistan right from the start is that the Australian Defence Forces developed a very sophisticated mechanism for monitoring the media in Afghanistan. When I was editing Overland, we published a few articles by a academic at Monash, a guy called Kevin Foster, who'd done a lot of research on this, and he made the argument that in fact Australians knew more about what was happening on the Western Front or in Gallipoli during the First World War than we knew about what's happening in Afghanistan because of the way that the media management was carried out. And again, you can see how the argument carries over. If you think it's legitimate to manage the media in Afghanistan, then you're going to think it's legitimate to manage the media in Australia as well. And the third example is perhaps a little bit less obvious, but in some ways I think it's even more important, which is to do with the treatment of refugees in Australia. Because, of course, Australia is one of these countries where the 9/11 attacks coincided with the so-called Tampa debate. Within about a space of 10 days of the 9/11 attack, a Norwegian freighter carrying refugees came into Australian waters, and thereafter the war on refugees, the bipartisan war on refugees, was always attached to questions of security and security management, which meant that right from the start the war on refugees was associated with the management of the media. People probably know that a famous memo that went around during the Children Overboard saga when Peter Reith was in charge, instructing the department to find ways to stop the refugees being humanised and to stop photos being taken that might humanise them. And you can see how that kind of idea that the refugees needed to be kept away from the media because otherwise they might be humanised culminates in a situation like, for instance, Behrouz Boochani having to write his award-winning No Friend But the Mountains on a stolen mobile phone, texting messages out to supporters overseas. You know, it's like something that happened in a Soviet-era gulag. And of course, to manage the kind of detention regime that the Australian government has been managing, it's necessary to carry out all sorts of attacks on the media as well, often in cooperation with the semi-client regimes in Nauru and Manus Island. I have some experience of this because at one stage I was going to go to Nauru to do a story, and I contacted the immigration department and said, okay, well, how do I get permission to go to Nauru? And they said, well, you don't ask us because, of course, Nauru is an independent country. So you have to apply to a visa to the Nauruan government, which I did. And then you never hear any answer at all. And we subsequently learn, of course, the Australian government provides Nauru with a list of journalists who are allowed to go and who aren't allowed to go. And there was a subsequent refinement of this process where they added a charge for applications for visas. So, yes, journalists can go to Nauru if they want to report on the detention centre. There's no law stopping them. You just have to apply for a visa. Oh, and the visa costs $4,000 and it's non-refundable if you don't get it, and no one ever gets it. And what that meant, it was almost impossible for anyone to cover it, particularly because so many of the journalists who would be covering it were in the same situation as I am, in that they're working as freelancers. So they have no institutional support and don't have access to that kind of money. And I mention that because I think it's really important to understand the attacks on journalism in the context of what's happening within the industry as a whole. Because, of course, the same day that the Daily Telegraph got raided, staff there learnt that News Corp was going through another round of redundancies and they were about to lose another 50 more positions. And this was in a context where News Corp had previously been cut to the bone on a whole series of previous occasions, like every other news organisation. And to appreciate what's at stake and how that affects the way journalists can carry out their jobs. If you're ever walking down Elizabeth Street, if you go to the corner of Latrobe Street, you can see the old Argus building. Argus was a long-running newspaper in Australia. It was a building purpose-built for an old-style newspaper. And if you ever get the chance to wander around in it, you should, because it's an amazing building. You can see where all the printers were and the compositors and the enormous areas where the papers were carried out in trucks, where all the journalists were and so on. It was essentially a sort of small village. It had its own kitchen, it had its own cricket team. But because of that, even though the Argus was a very conservative paper, it was also very well unionised, because all of these people are concentrated in the one spot, and so it was possible to organise them in the same sort of way as a traditional factory might be organised, both the blue-collar aspects of it in terms of the printers, but also the journalists. Today, however, the crisis of the media's business model has been used by the management to introduce a whole series of what we might call neoliberal management practices, essentially a process of contracting out everything that can be contracted out, getting as many permanent staff onto either short-term contracts or freelance positions. And because of that, the union now covers fewer and fewer people. If you're a freelancer, the union essentially does nothing for you. And you can see how that plays out in terms of the attacks on press freedom, because of course the raid on the ABC took place a few days after another scandal, this one about a purported decision by the ABC management to spike a story about the Carmichael mine in Queensland. And so according to Media Watch, they had all of these accounts that one of the senior editorial staff had been on the phone and had got off the phone and said to the journalist, look, nothing wrong with the story, we can't run it, we've got a message from on high that we can't cover this story. And now, the ABC told Media Watch that they hadn't been contacted by Adani at all, but this was subsequently undercut because Adani told Media Watch that they had in fact contacted the ABC. But you can see how in a situation where all of the journalists are not very well unionised and everyone's terrified about not even losing their job, simply that if you're a short-term contractor or a freelancer, it's not that you lose your job, you just don't get any work anymore. So in that kind of situation, it's much, much harder for people to stand up for good journalism and against their management. Now, I said that the industry is beset by neoliberal management practices. And of course, while these sorts of practices make the working life of most people much, much harder, they have the effect of creating some people who are doing very, very well indeed. And this is also very important in understanding the profession's reactions to these kind of attacks on journalism, because of course we know from recent reports the salary packages that are being offered in the ABC, and the top journalists there, and these are not these are not sort of the management types. These are people who are on camera as presented, are on salary packages. I think the top salary package is about $400,000 a year. And by commercial standards, this is actually not that high. Lisa Wilkinson at Channel 10 is purportedly on $2.4 million a year. So there is a tremendous gulf between the working conditions and the salaries that some people are getting and those that other people are getting. And I think that that's really important when understanding the way that high-profile people are reacting to some of these attacks on the profession. So the obvious example that comes to mind is the case of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, where we know that Assange is now facing more than 100 years in jail for the work that he was doing with WikiLeaks. And it should be stressed that these stories that he's being prosecuted for aren't anything to do with Donald Trump or Putin or Hillary Clinton. They're to do with the Iraq war logs that were published in cooperation with the New York Times and the Guardian and newspapers all over the world that won just about every journalism award that was going not only for Assange but for the papers that he was cooperating with. And furthermore, part of the material that he published at WikiLeaks at that time was the video called Collateral Murder that shows an Apache helicopter killing civilians in Baghdad. It should be pointed out that two of the people who were killed in that video were Reuters journalists. So there are obvious implications for journalists if somebody like Assange can be sent to prison for 100 years for doing journalism and defending journalists. But of course, this hasn't been the reaction across the board from a number of high-profile journalists. I mean, people on Twitter like Sally Neighbour from Four Corners. Who was that, Mick, that horrible person we were talking about? You was briefly a member of... Sorry, what's that? No, the other one. The one who was in SA for a little while. Patricia Cavallis, yeah. Yeah, you didn't know about that, did you? We're on Twitter talking about how Assange was not a journalist and therefore had no right to protection. And this was taken to the most grotesque degree by Peter Grest, who had been detained in Egypt on serious terrorism charges, was only freed after an international campaign on his behalf. He wrote a piece for Fairfax explaining that there were no principles of journalistic freedom at stake in the Assange case because Assange wasn't a journalist. And, this is a kind of extraordinary argument in all kinds of ways, not least because, you think about the attacks that followed with the AFP raiding, the AFP raided not merely the ABC, but they raided the Daily Telegraph. Now, if we're going to talk about publications that are, the pinnacle of journalism, the Daily Telegraph is not exactly a newspaper that would come to mind, but that's not really the point. So I think it's important to understand that there's a certain class position behind this logic, that people who are in the senior echelons of the journalistic position regard themselves as insiders. In fact, that is, of course, the name of the preeminent political discussion show, The Insiders, where journalists get down and they discuss with politicians who they mingle with socially and see themselves as moving in the same circles. That terrible show that Annabelle Crabb does, where they all sit down and they have dinner together, very much kind of encapsulates that sort of sense that we're all just good buddies together. And because of that, the logic of this position is an insider argument, which says you shouldn't attack us because we're journalists. You shouldn't attack us because we are insiders like you. And of course, this is an argument that may work for people in the top editors, of the profession who are probably not in any danger anyway, but it's not an argument that's going to work for the rest of us. Some of us don't get to sit down and eat raw meat with Peter Dutton or whatever. So I was just going to conclude by stressing an alternative position to that, which of course is the logic of solidarity. And I think, solidarity is not a very fashionable term these days. You're more likely, particularly, in university circles, to hear people talking about allyship and the idea that, You need to be a good ally and support other people when they're in trouble, because that's what an ally does. And often that's regarded as sort of synonymous with solidarity, but I'd like to suggest that actually it's a quite different way of thinking about the world, because the notion of allyship is based on the idea that the people that you're helping are completely different from you, completely separate from you, and you're helping them because that's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to be a good ally. Whereas the notion of solidarity is based on the idea that while it might be the right thing to defend other people who are in a position of trouble, the reason you're doing it is because what happens to them also happens to you, that you have a shared material interest. And we can see that, of course, with the attacks on civil liberties in Australia, because all of these attacks have kind of worked to a salami logic, where they have begun on the weakest people, the people who are in a position least able to defend themselves, and each time a right has been whittled away, it's been made it easier to cut off a bit more of the salami. And so the argument for solidarity is not that if you're a journalist you should defend refugees because it's the right thing to do. It's an argument that you should defend refugees because their interests and your interests are entwined, which of course is what we've been seeing with these raids. And I want to finish on that point, because of course the corollary of that is the reverse relationship, that if the interests of refugees are entwined with the interests of journalists, then the interests of journalists are entwined with the interests of refugees, which means that a win defending freedom of the press can actually have implications for other people in winning their rights back. And I mean, I think that's something worth thinking about, because I don't think the response to these raids was the response that the government was expecting, or that the AFP was expecting. I think that there was actually a sense that they bit off a little bit more than they could chew. And in fact, the general sort of response from the public has been a degree of outrage. And so there is then, I think, some opportunity to score something of a victory on this, to push them back. And if that happens, that will have implications for everyone else as well.
Okay, so our next speaker is Louise O'Shea, who's editor of the Red Flag newspaper, which is the paper that Socialist Alternative publishes fortnightly. You can see the latest copy particularly takes up the questions of the police raids, talking about the new, I guess, sort of the sense that Big Brother is watching us, the sense that, there's an incredible amount of surveillance in Australian society. There's a whole host of articles responding from a socialist perspective to the police raids. Really encourage you to get a subscription. We're trying to build up the supporter base for the Red Flag to make it more financially viable, so we can continue to put out radical political perspectives and understanding the world today, and also how we can challenge inequality and oppression. So welcome, Louise.
Okay, well, I'm just going to say something first about the media, just quickly, because people might have seen the interview with the representative from the Federal Police shortly after the raids, and when it was put to him that these raids are about intimidating journalists and sending a message to the whole journalistic establishment not to reveal things that the government doesn't want people to know about, he said, "Oh well, it's only because the media publicised it so much. If they hadn't publicised it, it wouldn't have been like that. It would have, wouldn't have intimidated anyone because no one would have known about it," which is just a bizarre response, as this is reflected in the smattering of giggling, because the idea is, if the intimidation had been successful and no one has spoken out about this, then there would be no problem. And I think that goes to what the government's attitude to the media in general is, that on the one hand there's the sort of raids and intimidation, and on the other there's cultivating a whole tame media establishment that dutifully goes along with the government, and that the government uses very effectively to pursue a political agenda. And so you see every time, there's dawn raids on young Muslim people in some outer suburb of Melbourne or Sydney, the government has amassed, a media brigade to follow them in with lights and make sure that it's splashed all over the news. The raid of the AWU office, the union office, that was all about, theatrics to make a point that, you can't trust unions. Unions are corrupt, and obviously specifically targeted at Bill Shorten. As later became a scandal, had been, the employment minister had made sure that the media was going to be there to publicise this. And so, that's the role of the media. On the one hand, you have the government cracking down and intimidating people that expose things that they don't want people to know about. On the other, they use it. And it's important because a lot of the issues that the government relies on to drum up support really are concoctions of the media. Like the idea that anyone would think twice in Australia about, desperate people trying to get here by boat, a tiny number of people trying to get here by boat that has no impact on the lives of the vast majority of people, if it was not for the media, going along with government's claims of refugees throwing children overboard, all the smears that come out of the government's office to justify their brutal treatment of refugees. Without the media, no one would, this just wouldn't be an issue that rates with people. Similarly, national security. The fact that, they can make people think in a country where there's never been a terrorist attack carried out by anyone other than the government itself, never been a terrorist attack, in a way it would be get people's pulse rating if they're racing if there was one, because it's a back end of nowhere where nothing ever happens. And so much the government is dependent on media creating this idea that this is an imminent threat, this is something that should be relevant to all of us, and then lo and behold, it's the political parties then compete to show that they're the ones that can be the hardest on these issues. And really all that is theatrics to distract attention away from the fact that no major party in the political world in Australia has anything to offer people that people actually want. Better health system, better education, better life, access to the things people need to live and be happy, better conditions at work. None want to talk about any of those issues, and they rely on what section of the media to be compliant to generate and make people focus on issues that play to their political advantage. And so, there's kind of two sides to the media in that way, the government depending on a compliant one and cracking down on the other side in order to intimidate not just the more responsible journalists, but also everybody, because as Jeff outlined, this is part of a whole creation of a much more authoritarian culture in Australian society. And it's kind of important, I guess, to think about how we got to this situation. Like, as I said, Australia's never had a terrorist attack, and yet there's more anti-terror laws, more national security laws have been passed in Australia than any other country in the world since the September 11 attacks. And, how on earth can this situation have come to pass? And to understand that, you have to look at why so many of these laws can get through Parliament. The media love to complain about the problem in Canberra and the problem with Australian politics is just all this, needlessly adversarial kind of squabbling over every little thing, opposition for opposition's sake. Why can't the politicians just find a way to cooperate and get things done, get some responsible laws passed through Parliament so we all have stability and we, know what to expect, blah, blah, blah. Which really creates the idea, I think, in people's minds that the major parties do disagree on a whole lot of stuff, when in fact the biggest problem in Australian politics is how much they agree on. And national security and the refugee policy are two of the most obvious examples of that. That there's been more than 70 pieces of national security and anti-terror legislation of various sorts passed through Parliament since 2001. Most of it, as I just said, any country in the world, and laws that are completely superfluous, that by and large play a political role, as Jeff alluded to, that are not needed to prosecute anyone carrying out a likely terrorist attack, but are needed to make people think this is an imminent threat, and to start taking away basic liberties that people expect and rely on, so that people who are not terrorists can be better controlled by the government. They've passed an enormous number of these laws, and pretty much every single one has gone through with the entire Parliament's approval. Like, there has been no major debates about this. There's been no sort of major contestation. The ALP have put up some very, minor kind of amendments to some of them, but by and large, expanding surveillance, taking away the rights of Australian nationals who are overseas in other countries having their passports stripped, which is a huge attack on civil liberties. All the litany of things that have been done, it's been pretty much with the unanimous support of the Labor Party. And that's not only important because it's created this situation where we have today, where, we've slowly been sort of boiled in our own authoritarian atmosphere. Like, when we start to need them, I think we're going to find that a whole lot of civil liberties that people kind of would expect to be in place have actually been chipped away through all these legislative changes that, are not necessarily things people are needing to use, relying on right now, but we'll later find that they've gone. They've been able to get all this through, and that's not just a problem because those civil liberties no longer exist, but also the fact that Labor supports them down the line has softened up the entire population to accepting them, because generally, like, what stand the Labor Party takes has a significant impact on public opinion, more than actually any other organisation in the country. The fact that vast majority of working class or organised workers still think that Labor is their party, the fact that the Labor Party seems like, to the smaller Liberals, the opposition to the Conservatives, what they say really matters. So you see, like, for example, when Kevin Rudd got in and made the apology to Indigenous people, prior to Rudd coming in, there was not a majority at all in support of an apology, because Howard had waged his campaign all through the 90s about how over his dead body there was going to be an apology, and Labor by and large didn't stand up to that. Yet within days of Rudd making the apology, it's something like 67% of people supported it. So when Labor takes a stand, it really has an impact in a way the Liberal Party just doesn't have. And so if you look at the polling about, on a whole lot of issues in Australia, polling shows the vast majority of people quite to the left of the political class, and things like funding for education, health, all those sorts of issues. But the issues where Labor is in lockstep with the Conservatives, it's a much worse situation. So I think it's only 1 in 5 people think that the refugee policy is appalling and should be changed. And on national security, there's very few situations where a majority is registered opposing any of these incursions. And I think we have to lay the blame at the feet of the Labor Party for that they're not prepared to stand up. And then that's had ramifications for for our rights at work as well, that a lot of people depend on or think that the Labor Party is going to do something about. The culture of in the workplace is, it's never been particularly democratic in Australia, but it's only gotten worse since September 11. So people know that all the draconian powers that the Australian Building and Construction Commission has, that if workers are questions, you're not allowed to have the right to silence. You're compelled, and the justification for that is, well, if workers might feel intimidated, like they don't want to dob on their mates, we need to make it so that they have to, and so that it's beyond their control. So it's like clearly measures to undermine solidarity that exists there, and that are about intimidating people out of maintaining any sense of solidarity, that people aren't allowed to talk about what goes on in hearings of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, and all of it justified on the basis that, well, this applies to anyone that comes before the Commission. But in its history, I think it's 3 times as many workers get hauled before it as bosses. So bosses don't feel the effects of that. The right to strike in Australia, well, there's never been a right to strike in Australia, but there is technically a right to strike, and it's just double speak, because it's the right to strike in the most specific circumstances imaginable. You can't strike about safety. You're not allowed to strike in solidarity with other workers on strike. You're not allowed to strike if it's part of a pattern bargaining situation. You're not allowed to strike if it's part of a cross-industry wide campaign. You're not allowed to strike if it's about, whatever, pretty much you name it. The only circumstances you are allowed to strike is if you have an expired agreement and you are negotiating another agreement and you've conducted a secret ballot and you've given the proper notice and the bosses haven't found a way to stop you using the many provisions available to them to stop you through the courts, which happens all the time, just happened with the Sydney train drivers a few months ago. So that is a very specific set of circumstances where workers are legally able to strike, and the fact that that's the only time they are implies that every other time workers may want to take strike action, that's illegal. And and they can the unions can be fined, and there's huge penalties for defying that. And to have such a draconian culture and intimidation and culture of intimidation in the workplace, it depends on that being the norm throughout society. And obviously you start with the most vulnerable, and that sets that lowers the bar for the way that everybody else can be treated. And so refugees have been at the forefront of that sort of treatment, but pretty much everything that happens to them gets eventually has ramifications for everybody else. Okay, another point I want to make is the idea that Australia has these great democratic traditions that are being violated by these latest raids. It is people should be outraged that democratic rights are being violated, because they are. But in fact, there's a whole continuity about these raids that goes back throughout Australian history. Australia, even today, has the most repressive kind of censorship regime of any advanced capitalist country. So, the government, these raids are kind of about what the media exposes about what the government does. But the government also just tries to control what people know or read about anything at all. So most recently, the internet censorship in Australia is the most strict in the world, as is the censorship of computer games. It is extreme. Not an area I'm particularly familiar with, but some people probably are aware that there's a whole lot of computer games you're not allowed to play in Australia, which seems mad. But also the history of books and literature classification in Australia. I think between the 50s and the 70s, more than 15,000 books were banned, and there's a class element to it as well, because people love to quote all the classics that were banned under this regime, like Huxley and James Baldwin and D.H. Lawrence, all these people who seems crazy that was banned. But the vast majority of these 15,000 books were just crap romance novels and stuff that working class people read. And as the censorship's been relaxed, the way it's tended to be relaxed is that the government says, it's appropriate for some of these titles to be read by university lecturers and the right people, researchers and university students. But the idea that the masses should get access to any of this is out of line. And the list, the Australian government didn't had a long list of banned stuff, but they also banned the list itself, that wasn't allowed to be public, because they were worried that if people even knew what was on the list, that would be a kind of go-to guide for what you should read. Although you'd have a tough time getting through 15,000 titles, nevertheless. And the situation was so absurd that in the 50s, the US ambassador presented a gift to the Australian government, which is a copy of Catcher in the Rye, only to discover that was on the banned list and quickly had to be removed. So, this is just a mad situation that Australia has always had a reputation for being prudish. And that kind of, it's why it's funny that the very people today who have taken up the catch cry of, presented themselves as the defenders of free speech in Australia, the Christian right, who are very concerned about the free speech of bigots being being imposed upon, they're actually, throughout history, the people that would have defended this absolutely puritanical sort of regime in Australia. And, it's been the left that has traditionally been the ones that have tried to speak out in defence of free speech and for more liberties and all of that. And yet, it's a whole kind of reversal now, really as part of trying to roll back the legacy of the victories that people have won through the struggles of the 60s and 70s, where, have a situation where it's no longer kind of acceptable to openly be a bigot. And, so sort of tables turned in that regard. Lastly, I think in relation to the whole kind of regime of intimidation, authoritarianism that we're dealing with today, is this has all come in a situation where there is no real threat to the Australian government at all. Australian society has never been more stable and obedient than ever before. The police force is one of the most popular organisations in Australia by those, social attitude surveys that are regularly taken. People by and large have a fairly unhealthy respect for authority. And, the level of class struggle is very low. You have this extremely repressive kind of industrial apparatus, all of which, introduced by Labor, that in a context where strike levels are the lowest they've been in many, many decades. Since records began, levels of union membership are really low. There's never been a terrorist attack. There's not any big threat to the government. And yet, and in a way, that's created an opportunity that the government just with, reckless abandon has created basically a police state around us, dependent on the sort of general passivity and general trustful attitude most people have to the government and authority. And, that's a real problem, because when we start to, we inevitably will, because we need to, start fighting back and standing up against the government and this whole regime of rules and intimidation, we're going to come a cropper with a lot of this, with this regime. But, I guess the positive out of that, though, is that, we don't depend on just, individuals having the right to, publish what they want in a newspaper or, whatever. What they are unable to legislate against, what they're unable to intimidate or find any effective way to address, is when mass action starts to re-enter the political mix. So we're speaking today, the 50th anniversary of the Clary O'Shea strike, where a previous example where a government did try to make an example of one individual, tried to say, we're serious about following through with our anti-union laws that bring with them heavy prison sentences. We're going to send a high-profile unionist to jail to show you, that we're prepared to do that and cross that line. And in a much more extreme example than today, the government bit off more than they could chew in that circumstance as well, because the day that they sent Clary O'Shea to jail, many, many thousands of people came out and strike all around the country demanding his release. And that's something that doesn't matter what laws are on the books, what rights the police have to put 14-year-olds in jail for 28 days with no charge, all the appalling things that are now normalised in the legal framework of Australia. None of that was an effective weapon when you have tens of thousands of people out on the streets. And that's why that today has got to be our aspiration, that we can't, where we can, people should be speaking out. It's very good that journalists and people like Julian Assange make it known to us all the terrible crimes of our government. But it's got to be about fueling a mass movement that can start to address the situation in a way that we can't be forced back into the box. Because, despite all the things that were exposed by WikiLeaks, all the terrible crimes and nefarious dealings of Western governments that were exposed by WikiLeaks, it's been a really important public service that Assange and WikiLeaks provided to us. But it's had no consequences for the people in power. Just like, the Panama Papers, many, many millions of documents showing the appalling, tax evasion of the super wealthy. And, people read it and they're aghast and they think, oh, but nothing, there's been, again, no consequences. I think maybe one person has voluntarily paid a bit more of their tax, and maybe someone else might be facing court at some point in the future. No doubt they'll have a very well-paid lawyer and, we'll manage to escape the consequences. So, just, revealing these stuff where people should have the right to it, it needs to be accompanied by a mass movement, and we can't let what the government's doing now intimidate us out of doing that, and we need to use this opportunity if people are outraged and get a bit of an idea of what's wrong with the society we live in to make a case that you need to be actively stand up against it.
Cool. Thanks, Louise. We now have time for some questions, for political discussion. So we'd love to hear your thoughts from the floor. If you want to direct questions directly to our speakers, that's cool. Or if people just want to raise their own sort of thoughts on the matter, also welcome. So yeah, if you just want to put your hand up, I'll try and get around. Sure.
Hi. Story. It's this guy who had been working for one of the French press agencies, and they'd gone through the whole process of terminating their long-term employees and then putting them onto short-term contracts and then making them casual. And so he'd been living in Bangkok, working as a foreign correspondent. He had medical issues. He couldn't get any insurance. He'd been cut off all the resources of his various employers because he wasn't working long enough, and eventually he took his own life. And his friends and colleagues wrote this post talking about his life and his work, and they were all foreign correspondents as well. And they made the point that this is increasingly how the news is gathered now, even in countries like Afghanistan or Iraq. In fact, particularly in countries like that where it's very, very dangerous for journalists to work, a lot of the news is now being gathered by people who have no institutional support at all. An incredibly dangerous situation. And so his colleagues said, well, it's very, very difficult to do good journalism under these circumstances, but it's also very, very difficult to even live. So the kind of notion that there is a monolithic media class, I think, is something that has to be challenged. But I would also think there's a broader point connected to that. Is one of the things that's happened because there is such a low level of struggle, and because so much of political debate and political interventions now take place on social media, I think it's led to an attitude where people see the media as a political force in a way that it really isn't. So it's an increasing cry, why isn't the media doing something about this issue or that issue, as if the media were a force that settled these things. And it never really has been that force in the way that one of the other speakers kind of alluded to. But I think that there's an increasing illusion in that because people now engage in politics so much by, Facebook debates and so on. It makes the media seem more important and more powerful than it actually is.
Yeah, well, the question has the political class and the media class betrayed Assange. Definitely, yes, as someone said. The politicians have, they're not doing anything to try and campaign for him as a, national facing hundreds and whatever, extradition, hundreds of years in jail for obvious reasons that they don't want to. But I think as well there is a difference in the way the reaction to Assange being now as there was in 2010. And I think there's a big part of that is the impact of the fact that he's had sexual assault allegations made against him and he's got charges pending, which is obviously a point against his character, certainly. But I think it's, when this is someone standing up against the largest and most powerful empire in the world, who's sort of the single person that's exposed some of the truths about the way the world's most dominant imperialist power operates, that is reason enough, no matter what, the sort of character of the person, for people to defend him. And it's become now, though, seen as comparably important that he's also had charges made about him to do with sexual assault. And I think that's sort of disproportionate. And I think that's, not a reason to not be defending him, because I think if the US is able to crucify this guy and the Australian government, standing by cheering it on, that is a blow for democratic rights everywhere. And to say that Assange should be defended against the US's attempts to punish him for exposing secrets about them is in no way to give your approval for everything else that the guy might have ever done, but it's to recognise that that's a key issue of democratic rights that's relevant everywhere in the world. And I think so much of the discussion about him now is focused on that. Everyone has to make it clear that they think he's a questionable character, and I think that's the way the whole issue has been really muddied, and in the US government's favour.
It's the oldest trick in the book, sexual slur.
Well, so clearly Assange is being persecuted not because of the dodgy character that he may or may not have, but because he exposed US war crimes, and that's sort of why the US wants to extradite him. We as an organisation oppose the persecution of Assange and oppose the extradition orders, and support the various campaigns to try and free Assange and bring him back to Australia.
The right in more recent years has turned the tables on that, and I think it's because the ideas that they want to champion are not ones that they feel confident or they feel it's most to their advantage to just be out there saying, no, women are stupid, or gay people shouldn't have the same rights, whatever. They don't think that's the strongest argument or the thing that they can rally the most support around. So instead, they have tried to make it always about their right to say to have those opinions, or and by doing that, they think they can gather a bigger support base of people who think, maybe it's whatever, but you can't tell people what to think. They get that sort of rally up that sort of more libertarian constituency, and I think that's been effective for the right, creating this idea that the nanny state's telling people what they think. So that's the political dynamics of it, and I think we want to point out the hypocrisy on that, because they're very selective about whose free speech they champion. They're not concerned, for instance, that there's young Muslim men in Barwon high security prison for having a conversation on the phone about putting a bomb in a kangaroo at the grand final, which is clearly a joke, and very basically thought crimes that people are in high security prisons for, as opposed to just, I want to be able to not feel guilty when I vote no on the same-sex marriage plebiscite. That's the kind of human rights abuse that the right are concerned about on that front. And all the other incursions on people's free speech as well in the workplace, industrially. Someone's been hauled in front of the courts for just having a sign on a picket line what was it, scabs are shit or fuck scabs or something like that, has been considered grossly offensive, and people get hauled before the courts. So it's all very sort of politicised at that level. So, and I think it is important that whatever the specific cases, I think we want to be more trying to stand in a tradition of the left is for openness. We're for not relying on some other or institutions of authority or laws to make society into the kind of place we want it to be. We depend on struggle and sense of solidarity and building up political traditions that tie people together and create a shared understanding of how we deal with each other and what society is like. The problem today, though, is that because our side is so weak in that regard, it's very hard to do that. So people feel like, if you're against racism, there is no anti-racist movement, that's of any consequence to rely on. So we need to sort of be trying to get someone who is powerful to do things for us, and that's understandable. But I think that's not the preferred path that we want to go down. And so then you kind of create a sense of censorship through just not people think it's outrageous to say or think certain things like homophobia or whatever, because there's a shared tradition that the workers' movement and our side, the left, has created a certain atmosphere. So I think that's what we should be trying to establish, and at the same time pointing out the hypocrisy of the right.
Well, yeah, I think the right wing arguments about censorship is just part of the culture wars, and I think it's basically entirely confected. Like they have this idea that, you know, if you're a right-winger, you can't speak out on university campuses. It's just like totally ridiculous. Like right-wing culture kind of actually dominates university campuses in terms of like the main things people study like economics and so on. And then like, I don't know about in Australia, but speaking out politically on university campuses in America are people who speak out in support of Palestine. And like those are the people who get targeted. And like, you know, look at the latest confected kind of culture war thing, which is about Israel Folau. Like, I don't particularly think, you know, necessarily he needs to be sacked from his job as a rugby player or whatever he does. But like the idea that he's being silenced is ridiculous. Like, he gave a speech in a church somewhere or something, you know, and it's printed on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And like, this is basically par for the course for these right-wing culture warriors. Like, you know, Andrew Bolt claims that, you know, his free speech is being silenced. He's like, well, probably one of the most read columnists in, you know, Australia, has the biggest platform, you know, of anyone, any journalist like writing this stuff, and that yet, you know, constantly is complaining about, you know, he doesn't have his free speech. So I think, yeah, like on that level, it's like totally confected, and it is just what Louis said, that like, you know, they just look for something which they might get sympathy around and then drum up support on that basis. The businesses of, you know, The Age and the Murdoch Press and like even the ABC, if you look at the board, like this is not really the free press. Like in many ways you can see, I think, these kind of institutions as effectively part of the state these days, and certainly like part of like, you know, they're big businesses. This is not like, you know, they're not out there crusading journalism. They want to sell papers. And like with The Age, you even like, you know, you scan down The Age website and like, you know, a bunch of the articles you see in the fine print, like it's sponsored, you know, content, you know, so, but they look like articles that, you know, could just be in The Age, but it's actually sponsored. And so I guess it's like, for me, it's like the institutions of the mainstream media, like even the ABC, I think, you know, you look at the board stacked out with like right-wing, you know, stooges, that like these people are the enemy. You know, that's not to say that we, you know, support like them being raided or whatever, but like we can't rely on any of these institutions to defend our freedoms because they are walking lockstep with government. And so I think for us it's like, you know, we've got to build up our own institutions that can maintain, you know, like WikiLeaks is sort of one example of that, where, you know, it's ordinary people who organise to get information out that the powerful don't want you to see. And so institutions like Red Flag and so on, and then distinguishing between the journalists who might be still doing good work at these kind of major institutions and the leadership of those, which I just think, you know, they're part of the problem, they're the enemy.
Yep.
Well, yeah, I wanted to, like, because obviously when talking about the mainstream media, it's obvious that they do kind of regurgitate the political line of the political establishment and the mainstream parties and so on, and like assist in stoking like negative social attitudes on things like refugee rights or a police state or whatever. But I was hoping that the speakers could, because like not all media fits into that category, and I think that there are plenty of examples historically of individual journalists in that category, and I think that there are plenty of examples historically of individual journalists, not necessarily media establishments or institutions, because, you know, they are run by the state or for profit by major corporations or business owners. But there are plenty of examples of individual journalists and photojournalists who play a positive role in raising awareness about social issues. And I'm kind of thinking about some of those iconic images, like the young girl affected by napalm in Vietnam in 1972, or the photo of the student shot at Kent State University, the Syrian boy who's washed up in the Mediterranean Sea or whatever. And then there's been plenty of exposés, like Julian Assange, or the expose of Watergate and the subsequent cover-up by Nixon. So I was hoping to that maybe you guys could comment a little bit about some of the positive role of a few brave individuals like that, and like some of the work that Jeff does, or that the things that are published in Red Flag, that do try to offer an alternative narrative or analysis of the media, because at work we pick up the Australian to do the quiz, not to get our analysis of current affairs. So no one really thinks of many of the mainstream papers or the television media or whatever as authoritative sources. I think it's just that they're hegemonic, but there are plenty of individuals who do attempt to stand against that, and what happens then is things like this police raid, which is appalling. And I think regardless of what we think of the media, it's important to be outspoken against any attempts to limit or restrict freedom of speech, because ultimately I think that it's left-wing journalists and individuals and protest movements that are the victims of those crackdowns. So I was hoping to kind of get a bit of a feel of both historical and current, maybe of some of the more positive roles played by journalists, not the kind of Andrew figures. So.
We might just take one more person and then we can have the concluding comments from our panel. So, up the back.
The more main way, it's sort of a liberal form of censorship, is the sort of Tony Jones on the ABC, that you've got censorship is very conscribed in terms of what opinions are allowed to be represented, and it's got to be respectful debate. So anybody comes and protests and shouts down some rugby fucker, that's got to be stopped and so on. So I think we're going to separate out, from a socialist point of view, what freedom of speech is and democratic rights are very different from the liberals. Because to be honest, the small L liberals are just as censorious, just as anti-democratic, just as authoritarian as the conservatives, and they want to very much conscribe debates and certain respectful limits and so on. And it leads on to the way they see it. Well, the way to stop homophobia or racism and so on is to have laws about it, and that rather than saying we've got to fight these things, people got to mobilise, demonstrate, unions and so on. It's reflected right throughout society. It's reflected in the consensus, say, around anti-bullying laws in the workplaces. We've got a situation with totally removed any class dynamic, that actually most of the anti-bullying things are taken out by managers and bosses against their supposed workers for supposed bullying them. And that's the totally idea that somehow, that this person in authority is going to sack you and so on, they're being bullied by some bloody group of workers who may be complaining about it. So I think all these smaller liberal laws that supposedly, constrain things, make things society more polite, are actually, to be honest, I think they're more a threat than the police raids, even though obviously we've got to stand up and fight against that. And it's reflected in every level of society. At one time you could go to the football and there wasn't all these security guards running around telling you what to fucking do all the time, and now there's hundreds of them and so on. And every element of society, the cops are everywhere, and this is taken as acceptable. You can't scream, you can't shout, you can't abuse right-wing fucks, you can't do anything like this. And I think we want to say, yes, from a socialist point of view, the world's not going to be made better by nicer laws, and that it's not going to be made better by a liberal state. It's not going to be made better by the fucking age or the ABC. That's for sure. They are totally hostile to our class interests, and we have to have a different form of democracy and a collective organisation for ordinary people. So the way to stand up at work about things going wrong is organise a union and kick back against the bosses, not to sort of appeal to legislation and laws and so on. In the same way, we've got to fight back against racism or whatever it is. We've got to do it ourselves and fight back, and not rely on laws, not rely on Parliament, not rely on any of these things, because all these fuckers are our enemy.
All right. So that's it for the floor, but there's a few questions that are still that people asked around, well, should we even use the term the free press? Also, Jeff obviously wrote a whole book on the whole question about censorship and the positions of the left, vis-a-vis the way that the right tries to champion itself as the fighter for free speech in the context of, the nanny state, political correctness gone wild. In other words, trying to generate a more normalised environment of, of bigotry. So, how do we counter that? So, it'd be great to hear a few concluding comments from our speakers, and then
in response to Laura's question about the positive role that the media can play, there's no shortage of examples of positive stuff that's out there. The Guardian has done all this very, very wonderful exposés about the government's crimes on Nauru. It's absolutely horrific reading. They had the whole Nauru files a couple of years ago of just all these memos from people that have worked there that, at great personal risk to themselves, releasing information about the situation on Nauru that, of course, is illegal, that people can go to jail for who work in these centres, speaking out and all of that. The government, in a way, I think, just revel in the fact that, oh, good, more people know about the horrific things we're doing to these people, and they've, just established it as such a universal that these people deserve whatever they can get. I think they think, oh good, more publicised about how hard we are. On the driving here, Christine Keneally's on the radio attacking Peter Dutton for not having been hard enough, and he's, took his eye off the ball, challenging Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership, for the Prime Ministership, because the week that he did that, a boat arrived, and so that just shows, he's that's the indictment of Peter Dutton, of everything you could dream up. So that's the problem, politically where we've got to, and it's very much a product of there not being enough political forces that can oppose that. The media role is to provide information by and large. Some people, even if some people in the media want to push back against it, ultimately the media becomes just a way of normalising all the horrific crimes in our society. And if there's no reaction to report on, if there's no pushback for them to also publicise, then it just seems like, oh, another terrible thing's happened and everyone seems to just accept it. It's normal. And that's why I try to emphasise the role of the ALP in just reinforcing that this is all normal. The obvious logical conclusion being we need an alternative to the ALP, we need a political force that brings together the people who don't want to just stand by while this goes on and turns it into a campaigning body. The media, it's not the role of the media. As Mick said, the liberal press, in a way, the people that don't like what's going on take their responsibility to appear neutral even more seriously than the right-wingers. We need to start rebuilding unions because, opposition to what government's doing, it's got to connect with the real social force. Rallies are important, but they need to be able to build to can bring to bear a power that can really force the government back. And we're miles from that, being the case today. But that's what we need to be clear we have to build up. So what's the first thing we can do now to move some way in that direction? For now, I think it means tapping into the people who are angry about the latest outrage from the government and trying to turn that into some political form. People trying to resist wherever they are, workplaces, campuses, whatever. And that's what Socialist Alternative is about trying to do.
I agree that in terms of the media, there's an old joke about opinion journalism. I don't feel like I've told this joke to you before.
That's all
right. That writing an opinion piece, which is mostly what I do, is like wetting your pants when you're wearing a dark suit, that you get a momentary warm feeling and nobody notices. And I think it's the case. It sort of goes to your kind of question, because most of the stuff that you write about, actually there's no shortage of articles about conditions for refugees. Everyone knows that things are really bad on Nauru and Manus. Everyone knows that things are terrible in Iraq or Afghanistan. The problem is what do you do about it? So the examples that you talk about, like Watergate or whatever, it wasn't simply the journalism. It wasn't with Watergate. It wasn't simply the journalism. It was the fact that there were people who were capable of doing something with this information, and that's the problem that we have today. But just on that, I want to go back to something someone said earlier on, because I don't think that the problem is today that we're in a particularly stable society. That I'm old enough to remember the 1980s, and that was a stable period. But the period that we're in now, there is such contempt and hatred for almost every institution, and such a sense of I don't know, like systemic kind of failure at the world that's being made for young people. The problem is that people don't know what to do about it or what kind of outlet for it. And I think that there is, like, in fact, if it were possible to present an outlet for instance, people to take the kind of action that Extinction Rebellion have been taking in London around climate change, people would flock to it. And I think actually there's a crying need for people on the left in Australia to present a kind of lead on that. You know, that if there were, say, some kind of socialist organisation that would, you know, like take a lead on some sort of direct action around climate change, I reckon that there's a real hunger for that kind of thing, because it's not that people think that what's happening around the climate is good. It's not that people think that this is a great society. The problem is that they just don't know what to do about it. So.
Yeah.